Welcome everyone. Today we introduce, or for some of you, we reintroduce the topic of non-motorized transport, this time tailored to Baguio, and we'll look at factors for successful project development and implementation. And together with Clean Air Asia, as part of the summer project, we are exploring, ideating ideas for Baguio. I arrived on Sunday. I really wanted to experience the closure of Session Road. I also met many very friendly people as I went about my different walks in the city, and I got to watch all sorts of fun activities that you have ongoing in your city. And for the most part, it's been very enjoyable. I've also met many of your officials from the city government, from barangay as well, and we've had a very active week. I say for the most part, it's been very enjoyable because there's been a few moments where my time hasn't been quite as relaxing. Every now and then, as I go about my walks, I enter areas where it becomes quite stressful, and it's especially in these heavily congested areas. But fortunately, we're all here today to discuss how we can improve situations like this, and we will do this by covering the topic of active mobility or non-motorized transport. And of course, what's needed is a much broader strategy, which a lot of you are also thinking about in your daily work. In the next roughly 90 minutes, I will introduce the summer project, just so you know who we are and what we hope to do. I can reintroduce you to the topic of non-motorized transport, which I'll do quite quickly. Then we'll dive into Baguio. And the main topic is how we can transform our streets, different methodologies or workflows we can employ. And we will do this in the context of a school zone. Throughout, I can also share some case studies of other similar projects or projects that I'm currently working on. And for those of you new to SMMR, Summer, it's an acronym for Sustainable Mobility in Metropolitan Regions in ASEAN. We work under the ASEAN Secretariat, and our role is to implement concepts and strategies for integrated and sustainable urban mobility across the ASEAN member states. And we have activities ongoing in several other regions. This is our capacity building program. This is us in Manila. You might see some of yourselves here, where we had a training with Baguio, but also Iloilo, General Santos, and Bacolod. And very briefly about me, I've had a very weird and wonderful 10 years of working all over the place, but the last 4 years really concentrated in Southeast Asia. A lot of my non-motorized transport experience comes from the Africa region, which is far less advanced than what I've seen in Southeast Asia. So I've had to start from the very beginnings and build up policy and infrastructure and strategies for different cities and countries. And I have to say here we're at a really good starting point. Not even starting point, you've already got a lot of good infrastructure, but we can really build on that. This is us at BAQ. I did give an introduction to non-motorized transport. If it's a topic that you're not familiar with, we do have a video online. You're very welcome to watch that, because today I will sort of start where we left off. And for resources and reference material that I use, you may already know the Global Street Design Guide, an excellent resource, highly recommend it. ITDP also has some excellent resources that you can use. And today we go deeper. We talk more on implementation, evaluation, and again, the Global Street Designing Initiative has really good resources. So I will very quickly skim through what NMT is. When I say non-motorized transport, maybe we can also encompass micro-electric mobility, and the standard modes we generally include is walking, cycling, small wheel transport, and wheelchair travel. And we promote it for lots of good reasons, but especially because it's an attractive mode for very short distances. And non-motorized transport is really the foundation of a transport system. If you drive a car, you will park it in the city and you will probably have to walk around. So even car drivers need to be able to walk and should want to walk comfortably in a city. Same goes for someone using a jeepney. And everyone is a pedestrian at some point in their journey. So it should be a very high priority in any transport project. And so streets, we've covered this in the past, but streets are much more than just spaces for the movement of vehicles. They're of course also for the movement of people, but they're also public spaces for people. We're not always in motion. Sometimes we want to stop, sit, talk, relax. And so streets provide these multiple functions. However, in many cities in the ASEAN region, in the Philippines, our streets are not designed for all of these functions. And that's why we really want to promote this idea of creating more complete streets that cater to all ages and abilities, and we'll cover the age aspect later today. The objective is really to create safe and accessible spaces, but also very enjoyable spaces where we can spend our time and enjoy. And it sees our streets as multifunctional spaces, something you know very well. I really like the night market here in Baguio, where you've created zones for the different movements, where you have your vehicular traffic, your commercial pedestrian traffic, who probably walk slightly slower than the pedestrian traffic on the outer lane. And then you've also transformed your space with pop-up shops, and you use the space in very creative, innovative ways. And the sheer volume of people can show that this has a lot of potential and it can be good for business. And the reason why we want complete streets, you know this, much of our time is spent on streets. And our cities are increasingly our homes. I think the Philippines is roughly 50% urbanized, and that's only going to increase. So we might as well create enjoyable cities that we inhabit. They're essentially our habitats. If we do it in a way where we have complete streets, we have all of these benefits: reduced traffic accidents, better air and noise quality, reduce energy consumption, more equity, more public space, etc. And in Manila, we looked at street design elements that we can incorporate to create better streets. And we won't look at these today, but we looked at how we can slow down traffic with traffic calming. We looked at good footpath design, where we acknowledge the different zones and how we can maintain a consistent and continuous right-of-way for pedestrians, but also provide space for the street furniture, cycle lanes, and active frontages, so the space immediately in front of shops. And we also looked at crossings, the importance of creating protected crossings where you might have a refuge island, staggered crossings. We also looked at network design, how you can design a finer grained network to make accessibility and connectivity better in a city. And then accessibility and public space are two things we looked at. There's many other topics we could explore, and if there's anything here that's of interest in the future, we can deep dive into a different topic. The Baguio context. Here I went for a walk. This was on my second day, and I wanted to just capture what I could see. And I'll share a short video, and I did an appraisal. This is purely my user experience. It's not a very scientific method, and it's not very encompassing of the non-CBD areas, which I have since seen. And if I was to do an assessment, we did it in Ortigas, next to the Asian Development Bank building, and they got something like 24 points. So a big improvement. There's just a few areas where if they were fixed up, you could have a very nice environment. And I'm obviously trying to be quite critical. I did enjoy my walk, and overall, it was very good. I also gave some thought to the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities and threats here, and the strengths I highlighted in the video. I then later in the week also saw other areas. I saw one of a few raised crossings, which made me very happy. As for weaknesses, again, traffic, people really like big SUVs, and there's a few areas that just could be improved, especially I don't know which bus station this is, but this is where I arrived from Manila. And there's a lot of big buses and a lot of people just using the same space, and that could be organized in a way that would be safer for what is high volumes of people. Then I just included this because I thought it was interesting. We went to the airport and saw what looked like the biggest crossing I've ever seen, but it was not, it was the runway. Not a weakness, just I wanted to include the photo somewhere. And then a lot of opportunities to further calm traffic, to maybe do some traffic management, some traffic signal actuation. As I understand, the traffic lights in the city are not optimized or as optimized as they could be. That could be something to explore if we are to improve flow, especially in the context of closing a street like Session Road. And other opportunities, again, this idea of cable car, I think that's a fantastic opportunity because you don't have much space. So if you can move people through the air in a vertical way, that could be a great way to, yeah, again, shift people out of cars and into an alternative. And then threats. What I keep realizing is Baguio is a victim of its own success. You're doing great work, but the pace of growth and the pace at which more people are coming to the city is faster than you can absorb by building new infrastructure. And I suppose that's a great problem to have. But if you didn't have this surge where you went from what was once 25,000 to almost 400,000, the infrastructure you have would be plentiful. And again, your problem is dealing with this in a context of growth. And so what we need to explore is a multi-dimensional strategy. On behalf of the Summer Project, we really promote the Sustainable Urban Mobility Planning Methodology or approach, SUMP. You have your Growth Node Development Plan, which embraces a lot of these ideas. And you know this better than I do, but we need to avoid promoting more car-based mobility, shift towards more space-efficient mobility, which will include walking, ideally also some cycling, and mass transit. And we need to improve the non-motorized transport environment. Also, we can make improvements to traffic management. And I visited the SC3, the Smart City Command and Control Center. Very impressive. You have very advanced monitoring capabilities. And I think in the future, you could also build in some control capabilities where you don't just monitor, but when you observe something, you adapt. Say you provide information to vehicle drivers through variable message signs, or you update your traffic signals in such a way that improves flow. So a lot of great things are happening, but a lot more could be done. And today we're really here to talk about streets and how we can transform streets. Street transformations. You may have done some of this in the past, but what we do with the Summer Project is we use a tactical urbanism-based approach. So I'd like to cover some definitions, look at some types of tactical urbanism projects with some case studies and how we can phase them. If this is a new concept, tactical urbanism is where you temporarily transform a space in hope to eventually make it permanent, because permanent change is often complicated, politicized, controversial. So when you change your streets, people don't like change, so you should do it gently and incrementally, and tactical urbanism allows us to do this. And often you would use things like cones and chalk just to test new ideas. You would use, at a later stage, maybe some paint and some street furniture to improve the space. Also, you could set up plants and pots to serve as barriers to guide traffic. And you can also get creative and create new public spaces in these areas with street art installations. And the idea is to involve local communities as best as possible. We bring in as many stakeholders, and this is what we're doing here. And we hope to involve you in the future. And we want to get everyone's thoughts and feedback and have their DNA reflected in the project. Because if we create something that's desirable for the greatest number of people, there's a higher chance it will be successful. And here's an example. This is the street before, this is it afterwards. And we can look at a few more examples and just generally how we can go about introducing these concepts and phasing them. You would start with a pop-up, and this is from a piece of work I was doing in Ethiopia. So the pop-up is something you do just for a couple hours, maybe a couple days, very low cost. Here we did it just using paint and cones. And if the local community doesn't like it, if we receive a lot of resistance, the rain will wash it away and we just remove the cones. No problem. If all goes well, and sometimes you need to iterate a little bit, move the cones, move the strings, move whatever you have set up to find a configuration that works for you. Then you can move to an interim stage, which is a project that would probably last several weeks or months, sometimes even years. You could say that Session Road, the pedestrianization efforts, is sort of an interim step, hopefully, if one day it does become fully pedestrianized. And that generally involves slightly higher costs. You will use more sophisticated materials. And if that goes well and you're able to source the financing you need and get all the approvals and all the public consensus, you can move to creating a more capital-intensive project, which would be a civil works-based project. And you can sort of see the workflow we went through in Ethiopia. And now many city streets have been inspired by what was once just a pop-up. A bit of paint, some cones, has now resulted in many urban streets being upgraded to a much higher standard. And it's just a really great way for us to trial ideas and demonstrate to the public what their space could be like. And each phase has a different goal, different types of material, and a different level of flexibility. Obviously, paint and cones are easy to remove and adjust, whereas once you've invested heavily into it, it gets very complicated to make any changes. And there's a lot of different types of tactical projects we can explore. A good start is with traffic calming, especially around, say, school zones, which is what we're currently exploring, where you could calm traffic using speed bumps, chicanes, so lane shifts, forcing vehicles to not be able to drive in a straight line by narrowing your lanes. Narrow lanes means slower traffic. You could do some modal filtering, so prevent certain types of vehicles from entering the space. Maybe heavy goods vehicles shouldn't be in some of these streets, so you could remove them, or you could do something as simple as some traffic enforcement, essentially to slow vehicles down to increase safety. This example I shared earlier is in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and here they introduced a roundabout. You can also see they made the cornering radii more tight, so a vehicle can't corner as fast, it has to slow down. That will increase safety. Also, the vehicles weren't turning in the intersection in a very safe way. They were occupying more space than they needed. And so a roundabout can be good for guiding people in a more guided way. So you can anticipate the vehicle movement better, which is nice for pedestrians. You also see the median has also been turned into a refuge island, and the curb has also been extended in some areas. And if you extend your curb, you reduce the crossing distance, and it creates a much more pleasant space for pedestrians. This began as a pop-up, and in 1 year, the treatments that they experimented with were made permanent. And there's a lot of data collection that goes into this. You have to survey people before and after. This is both citizen surveys or citizen dialogues where you ask local residents, shop owners, drivers, their thoughts. And of course, you can also do more technical surveys where you do traffic counts of vehicles, of pedestrians. And in this particular example, during the pop-up, 53% of drivers didn't like it. Obviously, we took space from them, so they did not like it. Pedestrians did like it. 82% wanted this to be permanent. And there was a 75% increase in safe crossings. And that data was captured. More consultations were done just to explore how the space could be improved. And after the full implementation, the data they got during the surveys was more positive. It took people a bit of time to get used to the change. And again, this is why this is a great approach, because it gently introduces these ideas and helps you manage the politicization of some of these activities. This is another traffic calming project. We saw the image earlier in Colombia, where you can see there's wider sidewalks. They've reduced the corner radius or radii. They've reduced the crossing distance. Vehicles here, if you see number 5, can no longer drive in a straight line, so they're forced to slow down on the approach to the intersection. And all of this is very simple, very low cost, but has, quite an impact on the local area. And here also data was collected. 93% felt safer. There was a 26% decrease in average vehicle speeds. 27% of people were using the curb extensions, and there was a 22% increase in people using the crossings. So small measures with, I think, some valuable changes. Then we can look at intersection redesign. I know the past two examples were also intersections, but the idea there was really to calm traffic. But you can do much bigger projects around intersections. I've seen some very oversized intersections in Baguio, and from observation feel like some of that space could probably be reclaimed in a way where pedestrians will really benefit, but vehicles will probably also benefit. These look like quite stressful spaces to drive into in a vehicle where there's a lot of potential for conflict. And if we could rationalize that through design, it could be a win-win for everybody. And this is a project I'm working on in Cambodia, inspired by Colombia. And whenever doing these projects, I do recommend searching online for other cities doing similar styles of implementations, and there's a lot you can learn from them. And that's essentially what we've been doing in Cambodia. And we wanted to transform this roundabout, and I'll go into more depth later on this case study. But essentially you have a big monument in the middle here. It's a Buddhist monument in a Buddhist country. And every day in the evening, people start crossing this very dangerous roundabout to go pray. And it's kind of a shame that they have to go through that to then do their prayers. You can also see there's a lot of tricycles just clustering into the street. The parking here is just haphazard, and it's a very unoptimized way of using the space. There's a lack of pedestrian crossings, and there's just a lot of room for improvement. And so we are currently exploring how we can improve this space. It hasn't been implemented yet, but we're now at a later consultation phase and gearing up for our implementation. So I'll cover some of the data elements that we collected to try to make this a reality. Other ideas are plazas and parklets, where you find an underutilized space. This is a car park in Istanbul where you can introduce features, street furniture, landscaping elements, just to reactivate the space. And if you create a more pleasant space, the surrounding businesses are probably going to benefit. If you have a coffee shop here, he will definitely see more customers, and you sort of revitalize areas in the city. And another exercise we could do is maybe pinpoint potential locations for projects like that. Street pedestrianization, you know this very well, where we remove all the traffic from a street. This is an image of Session Road, which, as you know very well, is, you could say it's very positively disruptive in some ways, but also negatively disruptive in other ways. And it's just a very difficult type of project to get over the line. You need a strong leader, and you're very fortunate to have a mayor who is quite supportive of this activity. And I wish you the best of luck. These types of projects do work. My city in Dublin pedestrianized the main street in the city centre. Well, it became the main street because it was pedestrianized, and it has the highest land values now in all of the city. Similar story in Copenhagen. Back in 1962, this was a very car-dominated street, and they pedestrianized it. It was not popular at first. People thought no cars means no customers, which means no business. But I can find you dozens of case studies where the exact opposite has happened. And in the Filipino context, you have formalized tax-based systems. So if there's more customers, there's more tax revenue. There's really a strong incentive to do projects like this. And here, quite similar, 1.15 kilometers of commercial streetway were pedestrianized, and over time they added new areas. And I think Session Road could also be similar. There's some areas off of Session Road that could be turned into public spaces, and then every day will feel like Sunday, which as I saw was really fun. Then when you do a street transformation, if we zoom out a bit and talk about the phasing of the different project types, and you've already done a lot of work, but if I was going to a city who hadn't done anything, I would recommend starting with the least disruptive types of projects. They're the easiest to get over the line, and you should always be trying to maximize public approval, at least in the early stages. So say activating an unused space that has a low impact on traffic, so the level of disruption is quite low. Traffic calming, again, you might slow traffic, that's the intention, so drivers won't be happy, but overall, I think they can see the benefits, and there are ways you can also benefit the drivers. And then as you move across the spectrum, a road closure has a very high impact on traffic, so it's very disruptive. So if you want to do this, your citizens, your local population needs to really understand the benefits, and not just understand, but have experienced the benefits of public space. And that's why it's generally good to move through the different project types before you do something very ambitious. But some cities have gone straight to road closures and the results have been good. But obviously, start small and work your way up. And that's what we have in mind for our project. It's also, from the project development perspective, a lot easier if you start small. The data you need is more simple and basic. So you may not even need to do traffic counts. If you just have a small project where you lay out cones, you can just use your observations and intuition, see what works, what doesn't work, probably spend time observing what happens during the peak hours, and that can be done in a very short time span. As you go to more complex projects, you need to collect more data, traffic counts for vehicles, pedestrians, get a lot more opinions, and as you go to a full road closure, that gets a lot more complicated. In the case of Session Road, you probably need to do a comprehensive economic study, a cost-benefit analysis, or even more, a multi-criteria analysis to really understand the impact, and a probably quite complex traffic impact assessment where you use sophisticated engineering tools. You don't need to. You could just do it and the impact would be felt by the vehicle drivers. But if you could anticipate the impact and produce a lot of good communication collateral to communicate to the public, this is the impact this will have, this is how we intend to mitigate it, here is the proof, here is our data, here is our simulation, then you can make these projects a reality. But of course, that requires a lot more technical studies, which requires more resource, be it cost or human resources. And so our recommendation is really start small and work your way up. Try to also focus on the most vulnerable groups. So we are thinking a lot about children. They are one of the vulnerable groups, especially young children that are, say, less than a meter tall, and elderly, and also disability groups. Because if you start with them, the likelihood of opposition is lesser. At least I would hope so. Generally, we can empathize with our grandparents, our kids, and people who are more vulnerable. So you will receive less opposition. And so we're applying this to the idea we have for a project in the school zone. And also start small or start temporary. Session Road is a big impact or high impact activity, but it's done in a temporal way where it's only on Sundays. So that's also a way you can test big ideas and manage the backlash by saying, okay, it's just Sunday, we're just trying it. This brings us closer to the idea for school zones. So we really want to start with streets for children, vulnerable group, and the idea we have is really centered around, in part, activating some unused space that we observed, calming the traffic, and there's no intersection at the school we're looking at, but I'm sure some of the schools in Baguio are around intersections and there could be room to tactically improve them. So going a bit deeper on the topic of children, obviously our streets have a big impact on our development, and we'll look at that more in the afternoon. But the streets you have and use to get to school will influence your health, your physical and cognitive development, and your social well-being. And these types of projects are also really good for bringing people together. Yesterday, essentially with a few emails and then a meeting on Wednesday with the school, Irisan National High School. We discussed a few ideas very quickly. We spun that off into a whole training workshop yesterday where we had students, teachers, parents, grandparents, and all of that happened so fast because people were just broadly interested in, these are my kids, my grandchildren. I do have an interest in seeing their experience getting to school improved. And in a matter of 48 hours, we gathered very valuable insights on what we can do. And what we are proposing also builds on the activities that are already being explored as part of this Streets for Children program. Now, I was hoping to just deep dive into the tactical urbanism workflow, go into how we can make it happen. And there's multiple steps. We're really at step 1 with our proposal for Irisan National High School. So I'll share where we stand and also share some insights from the other work we're doing in Cambodia. But step 1 is really the planning phase or the visioning phase where we decide what are the priorities for Baguio. We then consider what approach works. We do some long-term visioning, and when we break it down, this is sort of some of the ideas that have been circulating this week. We would like to reduce pedestrian fatalities and injuries, increasing cycling, and increasing the share of children walking to school, but also increasing improving their experience. So those are sort of the priorities for the project we're exploring. Then you need to consider, is a tactical urbanism method even appropriate for what we're thinking about? In the case of the school we now have decided to work with, yes, tactical urbanism has a lot of potential, so it's a good approach. And early on, it is good to estimate or see what kind of budget you have available, because you will be sharing with stakeholders who will be affected, and they will be curious to know, to what extent can you change and upgrade this space. Some of these questions you don't always have the ability to answer early on. Sometimes you need to gain a bit of momentum before they come to light. So that's really what you would do in the planning and ideation phase. And in the Cambodian project I'm working on, our priority was road safety. This is an accident hotspot. We also wanted to improve just pedestrian movement throughout this space. And here, tactical urbanism was a good approach. In Cambodia, there's still very little understanding and regard for non-motorized transport. So even raising the idea of a street pedestrianization is so unthinkable that we decided, let's frame our project around improving traffic flow. And through the improvement of traffic flow, we can also benefit the pedestrians. And when we framed it like that, we could get more consensus around this idea. We also have a long-term vision where we've identified lots of different intersections where what we do here could then be scaled and replicated. And to do this, we also put together a team. We have the Active Mobility Task Force, which includes the Ministry of Public Works and Transport, the University of the Ministry, the Summer Project, a local think tank, and then we've also received a lot of support from just local communities and the residents of this area. And so we also did some desktop research and saw this project in Colombia and thought, okay, this seems like a good kind of project to emulate or at least learn from. In this phase, you also select your location. So we looked at lots of different options and we chose to focus on an intersection because these are areas where you can have quite a big impact. They're very conflict-prone areas. And in the case of Phnom Penh, the city where I live, a lot of the intersections are way oversized. There's so much space that could be reclaimed. And if you ask anyone, say, this is Camco, ask them about Camco, whether they know anything about non-motorized transport or not, they will, shake their head and say, oh, that's a terrible place. It's always terrifying when I show up in my motorbike and I have to cross this space and everything is overlapping in a way that I've never even seen in the Philippines. We have a very high share of motorcycles and it's very stressful. So when we ask them about certain spaces, the people already know, and you can sense that this is something they would like to see happen. And after we selected our location, we selected this one, and it's called Takmao. We then prepared a detailed plan, and once we had that, we could really begin. And this step involves appraising the existing condition. And we sort of began doing that over the last 2 days around Irisan. We did some site visits. We gathered a lot of visual documentation. We have lots of photographs, lots of videos, and we're starting to understand how this space works. And it's a really interesting space where you have back-to-back-to-back jeepneys, especially at 3 p.m. when the elementary school closes, which is here. And then at 4 p.m. it continues when the high school closes. You have a lot of crossing right between the two school gates. You have some tactical urbanism already, you could say, to protect especially the elementary school kids walking up and down here, but you also have an open drain here, which is an opportunity area. If you could cover that, you could reclaim a lot of space. So then you can also do some trainings. So yesterday we gave a talk to the 12th grade students introducing the topic of, urbanism. We had to take a step back and acknowledge that maybe they've never even thought about how space can be transformed and that our streets are the outcome of conscious decision making and that they can have a say or some agency in how our streets are shaped. And we gave them a survey. We wanted to understand their subjective user experience going to and from school. We asked them lots of different questions on safety, on whether or not they feel there's enough, say, street furniture around the school. A big list of questions, I think 20 questions in total. And then we also asked them to sketch ideas over photographs. And we got lots of very beautiful insights, lots of great ideas, some very implementable and easy to introduce ideas. What we would now need to do as one of the next steps is a technical appraisal. So start doing surveys. There's many different types of surveys we could and should do. And what we've done in Cambodia, again, also did site visits, wanted to understand how the space works. And from that, we developed a survey. And it's not one survey, it's multiple surveys. We want to collect quantitative data, also qualitative data. So for the traffic engineering survey, we had to do traffic counts. We wanted to understand over a 12-hour period the traffic volumes. We didn't even know when the peak hour was, so we had to really collect in 15-minute intervals counts throughout the day and also categorize the vehicle types to understand just the general mode share. We also did a pedestrian survey where we did pedestrian counts, which is similar to traffic counts, but slightly different methodology. We then did an NMT survey, and I'll share some of the results, where we essentially studied the environment, measured the footpaths, counted the obstructions, counted the street furniture, and you'll see the maps we produced with that data. And in this process, we also did a lot of trainings with local universities. We also involved them in the data collection exercise, and it was a nice experience for them to not just learn theoretically how to do traffic counts, but how to go out and actually do them. And we did it using very rudimentary methods with the clickers and the sheets, which is a good thing to do. It's not necessarily fun to do it for 12 hours under the Cambodian sun, but that's something we could obviously do at the school zone or not. We know that there is a camera that does have analytic capabilities on the overpass at the school, so we could get this data quite easily, which is a very good starting point. And the surveys looked a bit like this. So traffic survey, that's the counts. Pedestrian survey also counts. The NMT survey, I'll show you the results. And the citizen survey, obviously you need to understand what the locals of this area think of the proposition of improving the space. So we surveyed 52 commuters. So people driving through the space, we stopped them, we asked them questions. We also interviewed shop owners and street vendors just to gauge what they thought. For the NMT survey, we looked at variables like this. We went around and we measured the existing footpaths against best practice. So if your footpath is more than 260 centimeters, I don't know it in feet, but that's generally a very wide footpath. And this is the results we got. So overall, our environment is good. You have good footpaths, except for this stretch here, number 13. But your total footpath width is only half the picture. You have to understand how your footpaths are used. And for that, we have to look at effective width, which is the width you can actually use, the right-of-way that's available to pedestrians. And if you compare the width versus the width you can actually use, it's not a very good picture here. Suddenly you have your wide footpaths, but you can't actually use them. And most of them are too narrow to even move across with a wheelchair. So it's useful to know that. And when you know that, you need to understand why the effective width is reduced so much. And generally it's because of obstructions. There's lots of different types of obstructions. There could be street vendors. There could be construction rubble. There could be parked vehicles. And there could be more like utility boxes that aren't well integrated into the streetscape. So we went around and we counted each of the obstructions, but we categorized them on whether or not they were permanent or temporary. So if you have lots of temporary obstructions, like a street vendor, they are easy to rearrange in the space. If you have permanent obstructions, like a electricity utility box, that's much more complicated. But generally, you'll find, at least in the Southeast Asian context, that most of the obstructions are temporary, and through a bit of design enforcement and later down the line policy, you can manage these, and suddenly you can free up a lot of your space, win back some of your effective width. We also looked at the surfacing, so how smooth the footpath was, and if there was a footpath. We looked at the presence of street vendors, so we wanted to see where they were. Again, they're sometimes an obstruction, so understanding where they are is useful to know. Here we have a big clustering of street vendors around what is essentially a public space there, which is probably an opportunity area to turn that into a market space instead of having lots of street vendors cluttering up the street. We also looked at where vehicles are parked, and there's no parking strategy in this space, but there's a lot of parked vehicles. So parking needs to be understood. So we have to count how many vehicles are parking, where they're parking, understand why they're parking there, and see if there's a way we can reorganize the space. And fortunately, Cambodia, again, is very two-wheeler based. So they're relatively space efficient, and parking strategies can be easier to introduce. We also looked at shade, and here we should look at shade and shelter, given that it rains. And again, if you want to encourage walking, you need to create the most comfortable environment possible. And if you can provide shade with shelters or green infrastructure, it's worthwhile surveying that. And yesterday, if we look at the sketches of the 12th graders, we can see a lot of them were drawing sheltered areas so they could be out of the sun and out of the rain. You can also look and map out all the different street furniture, and we saw a lot. Same could be done for the traffic counts, where I have a great architecture team working on this project. We don't have a great GIS team, so those maps were made in PowerPoint. But it works. It's enough to essentially communicate what we're trying to do. But it's not the most scientific way, I must admit. If I have the time, I will eventually get around to it myself. But we made even our traffic count maps in PowerPoint, and you can sort of see the volumes. And we did this for a 12-hour period, mapped it all out. And ideally, we do this in a GIS tool, and we can see in 15-minute, or we can aggregate in hour intervals and understand the flow of vehicles. So then we can understand, if we remove this space, what will be the level of service of the road. And for that, I don't have the outputs to show yet, but we are developing a micro simulation from the data we collected. Similarly, for the pedestrian counts, we tried to understand the movements, and there was surprisingly few pedestrians, which is no surprise. It's such an unpleasant space to navigate. It doesn't work in our favor if we present it as a space where there aren't pedestrians, but we won't highlight that as one of the main findings, but I'm confident that once we implement our measures, these numbers will significantly increase. We also got lots of information from the shop owners, asked them what they wanted: sidewalks, traffic signs, street lighting, greenery, benches, etc. We also surveyed them and asked them to what extent they would support some of the measures that we were presenting to them, and got their feedback. Similarly, with street vendors, they did not want to share much information, but they did want to see improved traffic flow. But they were, again, very suspicious because they are not legally allowed to operate where they are, and there was a bit of a trust issue there. Even though we were saying, look, we want to find ways to better integrate you. But of course, if you integrate them, you start to semi-formalize them, and it's only a matter of time before someone from a different government department will come and say, hey, it's time for you to start paying your taxes. Or we also asked commuters what they thought, and they also gave us lots of good ideas on what they would like. And they also didn't find that the space was particularly safe, and they found it quite stressful to navigate through this space. And then once we gathered all this data, we had a lot of very good inputs to put together a design. And for this, we worked with an architecture school. We brought them in. We had already produced a nice drawing, a CAD of the space. After we presented all the data to them, we asked them to start designing what they think could be good. So at a level that's much more detailed and perhaps more realistic than what we would get from students, then we took all their ideas and digitized them into a technical drawing that's also nicely visualized and shows sort of what we want to do. So this is what we came up with. And you can see we've reclaimed a lot of space where previously the three-wheelers and motorbikes were parked haphazardly. We've created a lot of new parking areas. We've formalized the street market. We've created nice traffic islands and allowed people to cross in two stages where previously there weren't any crossing areas. And we've added some green infrastructure, some sheltered areas. We've created a car park even for vehicles. There's a bank there, and instead of them parking all over the place, we've organized that space against the demand data that we had. And we've also just rationalized how vehicles move through the space. Once we had our design, it was time to explore how we can implement it. We gave thought to the different materials we would like to use. We developed a bill of quantities, so listed all the items we need, how many we need them, how much they cost, where we can source them from, and got a cost estimate. And the architects went pretty wild on their on their drawing. So the initial cost was very high. So we are going to scale back depending on the budget we can allocate towards this. And for this, we're still going around to a lot of the different development partners in Cambodia and seeing who can contribute what. And then we'll really decide what measures from the drawing we will introduce. That's where we are. We're mobilizing. And for that, we're also developing a lot of collateral, videos, doing social media work, and looking at how we can procure the material. Then we will go to implementation. And throughout, again, we use participatory methods to make sure everyone is up to speed on what's going on, why it's happening. And we're always ready to answer any questions that may arise. Or if anyone is in opposition of the project, we're ready with answers, data-driven answers. Then once we implement, we will evaluate the impact of the project. We have our baseline data. We will have the data post-implementation, and we can see what the impact is, understand the strengths and the weaknesses of the project, and position ourselves in a way where we can answer any questions anyone might have. Once the project is implemented, you do, of course, have to maintain and monitor what you've introduced. You have to clean it, you have to fix some of the materials that may be broken or stolen, and you can also organize lots of activities, activate this space in a nice way. And once you've done that, you can start thinking about your long-term plan. How can we scale this up? How can we make it more of a permanent implementation, and what civil works might be required for that? So that's the workflow, and we could and should create an adapted version of this for Irisan National High School. I have another section to my presentation. I don't have the time to go through it, which was more on Session Road, which is a more controversial project that has a much higher impact on traffic, and just looked at how we could do an appraisal of that, an economic appraisal, and how we can do a traffic impact assessment and engage the community on that. But that's a massive topic. But one suggestion that I've seen work well for projects is using tools like micro simulation tools. Does anyone know where this is? I shared this at BAQ as well. Any ideas? This is essentially a big roundabout, or used to be. Multi-lane roundabout, lots of lanes here, 4 lanes up at the top, 3 lanes here, a space where lots of vehicles come together. So this is the city center of London. It's Trafalgar Square, arguably the heart of London, where a lot of major arterial roads pour in around this big space. And this is 100 years ago. Today, the space looks more like this. So any observations here? Can you tell what has changed? Big hint. This street here has been pedestrianized, so it's no longer a big roundabout. They did this using a UNESCO World Heritage grant, which set out to improve this public space. It was essentially an island of pollution, and they wanted to make it a more pleasant space for tourists. And this has happened in a context of extreme growth. London 100 years ago was significantly smaller, with significantly fewer vehicles than it is today. Yet in the early 2000s, they were able to close off a street. And you can see what they've done. There's a small roundabout there in the foreground that didn't exist before. So how can you go from having a very big roundabout, multi-lane roundabout with a much higher level of service, to this in a context of growth? Well, there's a number of strategies that were employed. Obviously, they've over the years really invested in public transport to shift people away from private cars, but still the absolute number of private cars has significantly increased. And when they originally put forward this project, showed the designs, the city thought, there's no way this can work. The logic doesn't make sense, but they said, no, look, our idea is we'll develop a queue relocation strategy. And they proved it using Vism, which is a tool you use in Baguio. And in this tool, you can explore ways you can program traffic lights to hold back traffic, essentially. But you can program your traffic lights, all different kinds of traffic light systems in this tool. But in this particular example, they essentially explored how you could use traffic lights and demand responsive traffic lights to improve the flow. And the idea was basically, if this roundabout here oversaturates, there will be gridlock throughout the city. So we have to prevent that from happening. So the traffic lights right around this actual roundabout, they can detect the level of traffic. And when they detect a 60% threshold, they will send a signal upstream to a different set of traffic lights, and they will tell them to hold back the traffic. So essentially, this space here can never oversaturate. There will always be good flow. The buildup will happen upstream, but that's much more manageable. And they've done this in the areas surrounding at a number of different traffic lights, and they've essentially actuated their traffic lights at a network level. And they were able to show that with this configuration, this space can continue operating. And I feel that in the case of Session Road, maybe ideas like that could also be explored and communicated to the public. And you could produce a simulation and have nice visual outputs that are scientifically valid. And if that's something of interest, I'd be happy to give some thought as to what this could look like and what data might be needed. And these tools are very powerful. You could do a lot of other interesting work, do some emissions modeling or simulation in the tool, and also understand the potential emission reductions or the increase that would happen on the surrounding areas, and have all of this up your sleeve. So when you communicate to the public, you have the data, you have nice video visuals, and I'll leave it there for now. That was a lot of information. So thank you, everyone. I am open for questions.
Summer is an ASEAN-German cooperation project implemented by GFA Consulting Group and partners on behalf of GIZ. For more information on the Summer project, do consider checking out www.summer.asia. We look forward to seeing you there.